There are stories that the wind carries across the plains of the Old West, stories that pass from father to son, from grandfather to grandson, crossing generations like rivers crossing mountains. Some of these stories talk about gold and riches, others talk about adventures and dangers. But the best stories, the ones that really matter, are about choices, of moments when an ordinary man decides to do something extraordinary, of moments when honor speaks louder than fear. This is one of those stories. The year was 1874, and the plains of Wyoming stretched as far as the eye could see. It was a land of infinite horizons, where the blue sky met the golden grass in a line that seemed like the end of the world itself. A land of possibilities, some said. A land of challenges, others said. For Thomas Redford, it was simply the land he worked on. Thomas was 32 years old and had been a cowboy for almost half his life. It had started at 17 when his father lost the small family farm to debt, and he needed to find a way to support himself. Since then, he had worked on a dozen different farms, led countless herds across dusty trails, and slept under more stars than he could count. It was a simple life. Wake up before the sun, work until after sunset. Take care of animals, repair fences, follow orders, receiving a salary that was barely enough for the basics. But Thomas didn't complain. He had learned from his father that honest work was its own reward, that a man was measured not by what he owned, but by what he did, that integrity was the only treasure that no one could steal. That spring afternoon, Thomas was returning from a trip to the city. He had gone to get supplies for the farm where he worked, a medium-sized property owned by a man named Wilson. The boss was fair, the work was hard, and the other cowboys were, for the most part, decent people. For the most part. The way back passed through a series of low, bush-covered hills. It was a stretch Thomas knew well, having walked dozens of times in the 2 years he worked for Wilson. Normally, there was nothing interesting there, just dirt, rocks, and the occasional scared rabbit. But that day, something caught his attention. Voices. Coming from somewhere over the next hill, voices that sounded agitated, maybe even angry. Thomas slowed his horse and listened. His curiosity was aroused, but so was his instinct for caution. In the lands of the West, it was always wise to know what one was dealing with before revealing oneself. He guided his horse behind a group of rocks and dismounted silently. He tied the reins to a bush and climbed the hill on foot, keeping low so as not to be seen. What he found on the other side made his blood boil. 2 men were in a clearing, struggling to control a horse that clearly didn't want to be controlled. Thomas recognized them both immediately. They were cowboys from the neighboring farm, known for being the type of people who gave their profession a bad name, the kind who saw shortcuts where he should have seen principles, the kind who confused cleverness with dishonesty. But what really caught Thomas's attention was the horse. It was an extraordinary animal, a stallion with a reddish-brown coat that gleamed like polished copper in the afternoon sun. His mane was long and black, and his eyes were intelligent and challenging. Even from a distance, Thomas could see that it was a horse of exceptional quality, the kind of animal worth a small fortune, and it was clearly a horse that did not belong to those 2 men. The mane was braided with colorful ribbons in traditional patterns. There were paintings on the sides, symbols Thomas recognized from his travels in the region, and the way the animal resisted, the way it fought against the ropes that tried to control it, made it clear that it was not used to being treated that way. It was a crow horse, a horse that had been raised with care, trained with patience, and decorated with pride by its rightful owner. And now it was in the hands of 2 thieves. Thomas felt anger rising in his chest, but he remained calm. He watched as the 2 men discussed what to do with the animal. One of them wanted to take him to the city immediately and sell him. The other thought they should wait a few weeks, let things cool down, to avoid suspicion. Neither of them seemed in the least concerned that they were committing a crime. Neither of them seemed to consider that the horse belonged to anyone. For them, it was just an opportunity to make easy money. Thomas considered his options. He could just leave. It wasn't his problem. The 2 thieves were from the neighboring farm, not the Wilson farm. What they did or didn't do didn't affect Thomas directly, but his father hadn't raised him like that. His father had taught him that turning a blind eye to something wrong was almost as bad as making the mistake. That a real man didn't ignore injustice just because it was more convenient. That honor was not something you used when it was easy and kept when it was difficult. Thomas made his decision. He got up and walked down the hill towards the 2 men without trying to hide. The thieves saw him approaching and became tense. One of them placed his hand on his pistol holster but did not draw it. Not yet. Thomas stopped at a safe distance and asked in a calm voice what they were doing with that horse. The older of the 2, a scruffy-shaven guy named Garrett, replied that it was none of Thomas's business. He said the horse was theirs, which they had found wandering in the hills, and that Thomas should go on his way and mind his own business. Thomas looked at the horse. He looked at the decorations. He looked at the way the animal resisted the ropes. He said he didn't look like a lost horse. He said it looked like a horse that belonged to someone. He said the decorations were clearly crow, and that the crow didn't tend to lose their horses. Garrett took a step forward, trying to intimidate. He said Thomas was getting involved where he shouldn't be. He said he'd better leave while he could. Thomas didn't move. He said he was going to take the horse back. The silence that followed was as heavy as lead. The second robber, a younger man named Pike, looked nervously from Thomas to Garrett and back again. Garrett laughed, but there was no humor in his laughter. He asked if Thomas had gone crazy. He said it was 2 against 1 and that Thomas didn't stand a chance if things got bad. Thomas knew Garrett was right about the numbers, but he also knew something that Garrett didn't. He had noticed, as he came down the hill, that the robbers' 2 horses were tied up on the other side of the clearing. If he could free Crow and mount him, he could get out of here before Garrett and Pike reached their own mounts. It was a risk. But sometimes, doing the right thing required taking risks. Thomas moved. It was fast, faster than the 2 thieves expected. In an instant, he was at Crow's horse's side, cutting the rope that bound his front legs. In the next instant, he was on top of the animal, grabbing the mane to balance himself. The stallion, feeling freedom, took off like lightning. Thomas heard Garrett and Pike's furious shouts behind him, but he didn't look back. He leaned over the horse's neck and let the animal run, trusting his instincts. The horse was even more extraordinary than Thomas had imagined. It ran like the wind, its paws barely appearing to touch the ground. It was like riding a force of nature, wild and free and absolutely magnificent. When he finally looked back, Thomas saw that the 2 thieves hadn't even managed to get on their horses. They were standing in the clearing, shouting insults that the wind carried away before they could reach their ears. Thomas allowed himself a small smile. Now came the hardest part: return the horse. Thomas knew there was a Crow village somewhere to the northeast, beyond the river that marked the boundary of Wilson's land. He had never been there, never had a reason to go. The cowboys and the natives lived in separate worlds, occasionally crossing paths, but rarely truly interacting. But now Thomas needed to cross this invisible border. He guided the horse northeast, following the sun as it began to descend toward the horizon. The animal seemed to understand where they were going, because its resistance completely disappeared. He moved with purpose, as if he knew he was coming home. Thomas rode for hours. The sun went down, painting the sky orange and red and purple. Stars began to appear, one by one, dotting the growing darkness like diamonds scattered on black velvet. And then, when the moon was high in the sky, Thomas realized he was no longer alone. He didn't see anyone. He heard nothing but the wind in the grass and the stamp of the horse's hooves. But he felt it, a presence, eyes watching from somewhere in the darkness. Thomas stopped his horse and slowly raised his hands, showing that they were empty, and waited. The silence stretched for long minutes. Then, like ghosts materializing from the night, 4 knights appeared around him. They had approached without making a single sound, completely surrounding him before he knew it. They were Crow warriors. Thomas could see it even in the dim moonlight. Their clothes, their hairstyles, the way they sat on their horses, everything was distinctive. One of the warriors approached and said something in a language Thomas didn't understand. His voice was hard, accusatory. His eyes were fixed on the horse Thomas was riding. Thomas understood the situation immediately. From the warrior's point of view, he was a white man riding a Crow horse in the middle of the night. It wasn't hard to imagine what they were thinking. He needed to explain himself. Fast. Thomas pointed to the horse, then north, toward where he imagined the village to be. He made a gesture of handing over, of returning, and he said, hoping that at least one of them understood English, that he was bringing the horse back, that he wasn't a thief, that he was returning what had been stolen. The 4 warriors exchanged glances. One of them said something to the others in Crow, and there was a brief discussion in hushed tones. Then the warrior who had spoken first looked at Thomas and said, in heavily accented English, that he should follow them. The Crow village was larger than Thomas expected. Dozens of fur tents dotted a sheltered valley, lit by the light of fires that crackled against the darkness. The sound of voices, of laughter, of life, filled the air in a way that made Thomas realize how accustomed he was to the silence of his solitary existence. When he entered the village, escorted by the 4 warriors, the conversation stopped. Faces turned in his direction. Curious and cautious eyes followed him as he rode along the main path. Thomas remained calm. He kept his hands visible, and he maintained an expression that he hoped conveyed peace and good intentions. The warriors took him to a tent larger than the others, decorated with paintings that told stories that Thomas could not decipher. In front of the tent, a man was waiting. He was older than the warriors, with gray-flecked hair and a face that bore the wisdom of many decades. His eyes were penetrating but not hostile, assessing Thomas with the patience of someone who had seen a lot and learned not to judge hastily. One of the warriors dismounted and approached the older man, speaking quickly in Crow. Thomas captured his own tone in the narrative, the initial suspicion, the strangeness of the situation, the uncertainty about the stranger's intentions. When the warrior finished, the older man looked at Thomas for a long moment. Then he spoke, in clear and precise English. He said the warrior had told him that Thomas claimed to be returning the horse. He asked if this was true. Thomas nodded and explained what had happened. He told about the 2 thieves in the clearing, about the horse resisting, about the decorations that clearly indicated who the animal belonged to. He said he had taken his horse back and had ridden all night to return it. The older man listened silently, his eyes never leaving Thomas's face. When Thomas finished, the silence stretched for several seconds. Then the older man gestured, and a woman approached carrying a bowl of water and a piece of bread. He offered it to Thomas, who gratefully accepted. As Thomas ate and drank, the older man explained. He said his name was Red Bear, and that he was one of the village elders. He said that the horse Thomas had brought belonged to a young warrior named Swift Eagle, and that he had disappeared 2 days ago during a hunt. He said warriors had been sent to look for him, fearing he had been injured or lost. He said no one expected a white man to bring him back. Thomas said he hadn't done anything special. He said the horse wasn't his, and that returning stolen property was simply the right thing to do. Red Bear studied him with those piercing eyes. He said the right thing wasn't always the easy thing. He said that many men, white and native, chose the easy path instead of the right path. He said that a man who chose honor when he could choose convenience was a rare man, and he said rare men deserved to be treated accordingly. Thomas was invited to spend the night in the village. A tent was prepared for him, with warm, soft furs to sleep in. They brought him more food, roast meat, boiled roots, a hot drink he didn't recognize but which warmed his tired body. He slept better than he had in months. The next morning, Thomas woke up to the sound of activity outside. He left the tent and discovered that the entire village seemed to be in motion. People walked back and forth with purpose, chatting animatedly, preparing something he couldn't identify. Red Bear appeared at his side and explained. He said that news of what Thomas had done had spread through the village during the night. He said that young Swift Eagle, the horse's owner, was deeply grateful. He said his family wanted to thank him in person. He said there would be a ceremony. Thomas tried to protest. He said there was no need for a ceremony. He said he had just done what any decent person would do. Red Bear smiled. He said that was exactly why the ceremony was necessary. The ceremony took place in the center of the village. Thomas stood there feeling strangely out of place as dozens of people gathered around. Men, women, elders, they all came to see the white man who had returned Swift Eagle's horse. Swift Eagle himself approached. She was younger than Thomas expected, perhaps in her early 20s, with bright eyes and a smile that radiated genuine gratitude. He said something in Crow, and an older woman translated. He said the horse was a gift from his father, given to him when he completed his training as a warrior. He said the animal was more than a horse. It was a symbol of his journey to adulthood, a connection to his family and his traditions. He said Thomas had given back not just a horse, but a part of his story. Thomas didn't know what to say. He just nodded, accepting the words with humility. Then gifts were brought. Blankets woven in elaborate patterns, soft and warm. A pair of moccasins made with soft leather, decorated with colorful beads. A knife with a bone handle, crafted with obvious care. Provisions for the return journey. Dried meat, fruit, bread. Thomas tried to refuse. He said he hadn't done what he did expecting a reward. Red Bear placed a hand on his shoulder. He said they weren't a reward. They were recognition. He said his people honored those who treated them with respect. He said that accepting the gifts was accepting the friendship that was being offered. Thomas accepted. And then Red Bear gave him something else. It was a simple necklace made of beads and small stones with a falcon feather hanging from the center. Red Bear explained that that necklace was a symbol. Any crow who saw him would know that Thomas was a friend, someone worthy of trust and respect. Thomas placed the necklace around his neck, feeling the light but significant weight against his chest. He left that afternoon, laden with gifts and something even more valuable, the feeling that he had done the right thing and that his choice had been recognized and honored. 3 days later, Thomas was back at the Wilson farm. He had told his boss a summarized version of what had happened, omitting details that could cause problems with the neighboring farm. Wilson had listened, nodded, and said that Thomas was a good man. It was the most praise Wilson offered anyone. Life returned to normal. Or at least Thomas thought he was back. That afternoon he was repairing a fence on the north edge of the property when he saw something that made him stop. On the horizon, a cloud of dust rose. And within that cloud, horsemen were approaching. Many riders. Thomas felt his heart accelerate. For a moment he thought about running, about getting help, about hiding. But then he realized that the knights were not coming in attack formation. They came in procession formation, organized and calm. And at the front of the group he recognized a familiar figure, Red Bear. Thomas remained where he was, waiting as the knights approached. There were 50 at least, maybe more. 50 Crow warriors, mounted on magnificent horses, wearing their finest clothes. Red Bear stopped in front of Thomas and dismounted. His eyes were shining with something that looked like joy. He said he had promised that the friendship offered was real. He said his people kept their promises. And he said they had come to bring a gift. A warrior approached, leading a horse by the reins. It was a young, strong, healthy animal with black fur that shined like polished obsidian. It was clearly a horse of exceptional quality, bred with all the care and expertise for which the Crows were famous. Red Bear said the horse was for Thomas, a gift from the tribe in recognition of their honor and integrity, a symbol of a friendship they hoped would last many years. Thomas looked at the horse, then at Red Bear, then at the 50 warriors who had ridden for days to deliver this gift. He had no words. Red Bear smiled, seeming to understand, said there was more. He said Thomas had shown himself to be a man who could be trusted. He said men like that were valuable, especially in difficult times. He said that if Thomas ever needed help of any kind, he could just send a message to the village. The Crow would come. And he said that if Thomas wanted to, he would always be welcome among his people, to visit, to talk, to learn about their traditions and share your own. He said that friendship, once offered, had no expiration date. Thomas finally found his voice. He said the honor was his. He said he never expected anything in return for what he had done, but that he was deeply touched by the generosity they were showing. I said, yes, I would really like to visit the village. I would love to learn more about the Crow people. I would love to cultivate this friendship and that it was being born. Red Bear nodded, satisfied. Then he said goodbye, mounted his horse, and led the 50 warriors back to where they had come. Thomas stood still for a long time, holding the reins of the black horse, watching the procession disappear over the horizon. He couldn't stop smiling. The following years were extraordinary. Thomas kept his promise. He visited the Crow village regularly, learning about its traditions, its history, its way of seeing the world. In return, he shared what he knew. Cattle-raising techniques, knowledge about the white men who were increasingly present in the region, warnings about problems that could affect the tribe. The friendship blossomed. Red Bear became like a second father to Thomas, offering wisdom and guidance that he had never received from anyone else. The young warriors became like brothers, teaching him to ride as they rode, to track as they tracked, to see the land as they did. And Thomas changed. Not just on the outside, although that was true too. He wore the Red Bear necklace every day, a constant reminder of the friendship he had gained. He cared for the black horse devotedly, treating it not as property but as a partner. But the biggest change was inside. Thomas stopped being just a cowboy who worked to survive. He became a man with purpose, with connections, with a place in the world that went beyond the farm where he worked. He became a bridge between two peoples, someone who could translate not just words but intentions and values. 5 years after that afternoon in the clearing, Thomas opened his own farm. He bought a piece of land not far from Crow Village with money he had saved over the years. It was a modest property, but it was his. And when he needed help building the house and barn, it wasn't just white workers who showed up. The Crow came too. Warriors who had become friends worked side by side with hired cowboys, building walls and repairing fences. The village women brought food and blankets. Children ran around the property, filling it with laughter and energy. It was a sight that would have been impossible a few years earlier. Two people, working together, building something together, all because a man had chosen to return a stolen horse. Thomas got married at the age of 40. Her name was Margaret, a woman with red hair and a strong spirit who had come from the east with her family. They met in town when Thomas was selling some horses. Margaret had been fascinated by his story, by his friendship with the Crows, by the way he talked about honor and integrity. When Thomas took her to see Red Bear in the village, Margaret was welcomed like family. The wedding took place on Thomas's farm. And among the guests, side by side with neighbors and city merchants, were 50 Crow warriors. 50 warriors who had started as strangers, became allies, and ended up as family. Thomas Redford lived to be 78. His farm prospered and grew, passing it on to his children and grandchildren. Friendship with the Crow has endured through the generations, even as the world around them changed in ways no one could have predicted. And when Thomas was buried on a hill overlooking the land he had loved, representatives of the Crow tribe came to pay their respects. Among them was Red Bear's grandson, a young man who bore his grandfather's name. He approached the tomb and placed an eagle feather on the tombstone. He said Thomas had been more than a friend. It had been proof that honor knew no boundaries. It had been a bridge when bridges were rare. It had been a reminder that even in difficult times there were good people everywhere. He said his people would never forget him, and they didn't forget. This is the story of Thomas Redford, an ordinary cowboy who made an unusual choice. When he saw something wrong, he acted. When he could have ignored it, he intervened. When most would have turned their backs, he faced it. And that choice transformed his life in ways he never could have imagined. But the true beauty of this story isn't in Thomas's transformation. It's in what this transformation represents. Proof that kindness breeds kindness, from what honor attracts honor. that when we treat others with respect, that respect returns multiplied. Thomas returned a horse because it was the right thing to do. He didn't expect anything in return, did not calculate benefits, didn't weigh risks against rewards. He simply did what his father had taught him to do. And the universe, in some mysterious way, responded. 50 warriors on the horizon, not as a threat, but as a gift. Not as enemies, but as friends. Not as the end of a story, but as the beginning of a but new. Because that's how honor works. It plants seeds that bloom when we least expect it. She builds bridges where there were once chasms. She turns strangers into family. A horse returned. 3 days of waiting. 50 warriors returning. And a lifetime of friendship, purpose, and meaning. All because one man chose to do the right thing.